Well, I would like to welcome all of you tonight to our forum on food safety. And I am awfully glad to see how many people are interested and concerned about these issues. I know that the committee that has been working to put it all together has given it a great deal of time, energy, and commitment. This is a national study that the League of Women Voters for the United States has been working on for the last 2 years. And what we are doing tonight is a part of the process, a part of the League process of coming to consensus on positions that we hold. So once we have the forum tonight, during the unit meetings, it will be discussed further. There's a list of questions that the National League has asked us to come to consensus about. We will then communicate with the National League, and by this summer, when the League meets in convention in Dallas, Texas, there will be a position, a new position perhaps, to deal with all of the changes in food production that have happened since the last time the food safety study in agriculture was done some years ago. So there have been so many changes in how food is produced that the study itself even includes the idea that we haven't covered it all yet. We don't know what it will be. So thank you for coming. I am Janet Winans. I am the acting president of the League, and I would like to, as I am welcoming you, I'd like you to know some of the other things that are happening in the coming month and in the coming months. This week, the Board of Directors voted to endorse Proposition King County, let me read it so that I've got the whole words right. King County Proposition 1, the bill that, or the ballot issue that will be voted on by the 22nd of April, that will enact a $60 annual vehicle fee and a 0.1% increase in the sales tax to fund roads and transit in the county. We are going to be having an information forum about this issue on the 22nd of March. It will be at Town Hall. It will be at 11:30 in the morning to 12:30 on Saturday. So there will be continuing information that comes in the constant contact, and we would very much like to have not only you to come to that forum, but to let other people know that we are having the forum. It is also jointly sponsored by Town Hall because they have made a commitment to the transportation needs of the community. We particularly want people who live outside the city of Seattle to know about the forum. We are trying to reach all areas of the county. It's not just a city of Seattle issue. In May, on the 28th of May, the Seattle League is organizing a major fundraising event that we are well, the working title is Can't We All Get Along Political Breakfast. That's the working title. We hope to have something more clever before, and feel free to offer your own suggestions. What we will be doing at the Westin Hotel is inviting all of the people who will have the 28th is after the filing date for the fall election. So we will invite all of the candidates who have filed for election in King County to come and join us for what we intend will be a very, very entertaining gathering. So it will be political people, the people who support political people, and the people who are very interested in what political people do to come and join us for breakfast and to have a good time. So hope that too will be announced many times between now and then, and if you have assistance you'd like to offer, we would very much like to have it. And next month, the forum here will be about the living wage. I'd like to celebrate our currency. We are ready at the time with an issue that is very much in the news today, so come and learn what we know now, and you will know then. So thank you for coming, and I would like to introduce Carol.
I'm here.
Oh, Carol. Carol Burton. Carol Burton, who is the person in charge of this event.
Well, I don't know if I'm in charge. I've had a very small but very great committee, and we would not be here without them. As I say, Mary squared, Mary Berkey, who did all the speakers and did a draft for the questions and everything, and you've taken my notes. And Mary Ellis, who's sitting over there, who wrote the voter article and the cover piece, and then Allison, of course, who did all the logistics for this event, which we would not be here without her, or without the others. Let me quickly introduce the panel. Starting at this side, we have Trudy Bialic. Am I pronouncing your name right? Trudy is with our own PCC Natural Markets. She's the Director of Public Affairs. She specializes in food industry practices, ingredient standards, consumer food concerns, and consumer education. And she's also on an advisory board for Washington State University and a number of other committees relating to food safety. Next to her is Siri Erickson Brown, who has a very interesting resume. Started out with a master's in public administration and then turned to running a small farm out in Carnation. They have a great website if you want to look at that. It's localrootsfarm.com, right?
Correct.
Yep. Where they grow vegetables, they have CSA, they supply restaurants. They're at Queen Anne Farmers Market and Broadway Farmers Market, and then they also have a farm stand, and they're busy growing more kids and doing their bit for the 1.8 children per family here. And next to them is Chris Skilton, who works for King County Department of Health. He started out with a bachelor's degree in biology, moved on to environmental science, and then into the whole food safety thing. He is a food safety inspector, I think that's your title. Have I got it right?
Investigator.
Investigator. Ooh, that sounds much better than inspector, doesn't it?
Sounds scarier.
Yeah, for King County, specializing in retail restaurants. And we sent them some questions ahead of time so that they'd come prepared. But then there's also cards that if you have questions, you can write on them, and then we'll, as much as we have time, at the end we'll talk about that. So our first question for the panel, and I guess we'll start with Trudy. Oh, whoops. Did we say 3 minutes each? Yeah, Mary is the timer, and we'll hold up 30 seconds, and then stop, and then a great big hook comes down from the ceiling. So yes, we've given you big questions with not a lot of time, I know. Briefly tell us what you do and how you arrived at your current position. So we can start with Trudy.
Well, I like Carol said, I work on product issues and consumer concerns. Oh, sure. I do work on product issues and consumer concerns. It covers I made a little list here, but it deals with everything from artificial additives and preservatives to arsenic levels in foods and supplements, animal welfare standards, growth hormones, antibiotics, irradiation, genetically engineered foods, plastics, other contact substances, packaging, USDA, FDA, EPA regulations, and just labeling in general. I'm always been good in science. I was a sciencey kid in high school, and I studied science at Yale. And I went to work in broadcasting for about 15 years. I specialized in investigative work and won a bunch of awards and decided it was time to do something I cared about, so I shifted into the food industry where I was looking for food that tasted as good as it did in Ohio, where I came from. So that's my background.
Siri? Go for it.
I'm going to speak into the microphone. I grew up in Seattle. I was a city kid, but my grandparents all grew up on farms, and I had a strong imprint from an early age about growing food and spending time outdoors and frugality and self-sufficiency. And my parents were kind of back to the landers in the early 70s. They had some property over on the Kitsap Peninsula. So I got to grow up in the dirt, but also in the city, and always, I think, fantasized a little bit about farming, not actually with any real knowledge of what that meant. So after college at the University of Washington and grad school, and sorry to say, severe disillusionment with the prospect of working in government, I got an opportunity to spend a summer working on an organic farm out in the Snoqualmie Valley, where despite being a lifetime King County resident, I really had never been before. So one thing led to another. I found myself starting a small farm with a landowner who already had some acreage and a tractor and a greenhouse, and was a hermit and wanted partners who could interact with humans. So my husband and I farmed there for 4 years, and then all in about 3 months, we had a severe falling out with our partner, had a baby, and then bought a 40-acre farm, also in the Snoqualmie Valley, and with a 2-month-old, moved into a rundown farmhouse that had been unoccupied for 6 years. Started plowing new ground, building greenhouses, and hit the ground running that following spring. We sell produce, we grow vegetables, anything that will grow here, and even some things that can't. And we sell at farmers markets to a 200+ member CSA, that's a community-supported agriculture program where you get a box of vegetables. And we sell to about 30 restaurants in Seattle. So I also serve as a King County Agriculture Commissioner, and I can't say no to committees and things of that nature, despite my best efforts. So I serve on a number of committees advising the county on topics ranging from conflicts between salmon recovery and agricultural preservation to, well, there's lots of other things, but, and I'm having a baby in April, so, you know, it never gets boring.
And in her spare time. Chris?
I'm going to leave parts of my checkered past out, but I did return to school as an adult to get a bachelor's degree after kicking around and doing a lot of work for people I didn't respect, work I didn't like, and discovered that my real love all my life has been biology, and that there was actually a possible career in it. So I've been with King County 21 years, starting in a sewage treatment plant laboratory, then to waste surveillance, looking for illegal dumping of chemicals, and from there to the food program, where I fell in love with it. I've done that for the past 18 years, with one brief 3-year stint just doing outbreak investigations as an epidemiologist. And then I came back to food and get to do pretty much what I like. I currently inspect and teach in the university district. That's my current territory. So everything from some very high-end places to frat house kitchens, if you can imagine. So
That's scary.
sometimes teacher, sometimes policeman, most times in between. And I love what I do, and someone pays me to do it.
And isn't that great? Okay, our next question is, we're sort of setting the stage. There's a lot to cover, as you might imagine, in a very short space of time here. What major safety issues do you see in the production of food, both processed and non-processed? And shall we start with Chris and come back, and feel free to jump in, the rest of you.
Okay, because I'm in retail food, I don't see a whole lot of the side of production. I see retail, but when I do outbreak investigations, and in the past 2 days I've had 2 to do, I do see elements from production, and that would be situations where produce is contaminated in the field, or in processing contaminated with allergens, or in the most recent cases where it's grown in shallow waters where our sewage goes and then is consumed raw. And of course, I mean oysters. I think that's the biggest risk, is contamination. The other big risk I see is the use of animal hormones masquerading as the use of pesticides.
You want to be next, Siri?
So when you grow food, you're interacting with the natural world. We grow food in and with and sometimes against nature, and there's a lot of poop in the world, and there always has been. And whether you're gardening in your backyard in Seattle where your neighbor's cat may use your garden as a bathroom, or whether you're farming in the Snoqualmie Valley where occasionally your neighbor's cow may get out, there are lots and lots and lots of ways that animal and human pathogens of various natures can come in contact with food. I think about this a lot because there are all sorts of new, both voluntary and potentially mandatory regulations facing produce growers if you sell fresh produce. My husband spent a lot of time over the last year being involved with comments for the Federal Food Safety Modernization Act, which would regulate farms that have never been regulated before. We've all been sort of just doing our own thing, and no one's really paid any attention to us as long as what we're producing is a raw agricultural product, which means vegetables and fruit. So there's a lot of new scrutiny being paid, partly I think because there have been some really serious outbreaks traced back to farm produce in the last 10 years. But the way I like to think about it is there are a lot of different people who touch your food from the moment that it's harvested until it gets to your plate. And the more people that are handling your food, the more opportunities that there are for a pathogen of some nature to find its way onto your head of lettuce. I think we can put a lot of regulations and pay a lot of attention to the point up until when it maybe gets to the grocery store, but there's no guarantee that the person in front of you in line hasn't sneezed or not washed their hands before they handled the peach that then you ended up buying, or that salmonella didn't drip out of a bag of chicken that went down the conveyor belt before you put your apples down. So I think there's a sensible role for regulation to play. I also think there's a lot of common sense practices that we all should be using when we think about food and think about all the people who'd contacted that food before it got to you. And I was going to say something about aggregation of huge quantities of produce all being washed in the same water before it gets put into a little clever Ziploc bag and then shipped for thousands of miles before it gets to you. And the likelihood, it's all an odds game. What's the likelihood that that's going to make you sick versus a bunch of spinach that you buy at a farmer's market? So.
And I'm going to pick up on that because to me, without trying to duplicate anything here, to me, there are 2 things I want to talk about. And one is having smaller circles of dependence instead of these large national systems where there's no traceability. When we were a few years ago, when raw spinach was out and the bagged spinaches all had to be pulled, we were still able to sell spinach because we had local growers who were not putting it in bags and had nothing to do with California, and we had complete traceability to the grower. A lot of retailer grocers don't have that luxury because they're buying only from large national distributors. So having smaller circles of dependence and getting away, I think, I would like to see us re-regionalize our food system rather than having an international, national, pooled supply like Siri was describing. The second thing that really concerns me is concentration in general. Concentration, anytime you concentrate anything, we make ourselves vulnerable. We made ourselves vulnerable by concentrating people in a tall building in the World Trade Center. We make ourselves vulnerable by concentrating genetics in one kind of cow or one kind of corn. It's what happened with the Irish potato famine. There's a blight that hits and the whole crop gets wiped out. If you have diversity, you have hedged against those pests and the things that come in to interrupt the food supply. So I see food safety as being really very much the same thing as food security. So for me, re-regionalizing the food system, having smaller circles of dependence, and trying to get away from concentrated supplies. I'm very concerned about the concentrated seed supply. Only a handful of companies, 5 companies now own more than half the world's seed supply, and that is a concern for me because it has dramatically changed the farmer's relationship to seed. The farmers have lost control of the seed primarily. It's being owned by international, multinational corporations, and farmers are, in many cases, feel like they're becoming sharecroppers because they're leasing seed lines and can't control the seeds that they can even grow. So concentration in the seed supply, it's the blueprints of our food, it's the blueprints of life, and seed is now being co-opted by multinational corporations. So I think that is a real serious concern for food security.
Thank you. Now let's move into food safety. We constantly see new food products in the grocery store that have been processed in some way to be new and different, and we've all done that. I mean, when my grandson was here and he was 10, we went to the grocery stores and picked out weird stuff that he would not eat or not be allowed to eat at home just to see what they were like. Most of them tasted pretty bad, but you know, they're touted as something new and wonderful. What should the government be doing to ensure that these products are safe? And think about both before and after the new products come to market. And who wants to start? Shall we jump with Siri in the middle here?
Oh, geez.
Are you ready?
I was ready. I had a really good answer to this.
Oh, sorry. Do one of the other two want to rescue her and it'll come?
Rescue me.
I can jump in. I would like to see pre-market safety assessments and transparency through labeling, through real transparency through labeling, but food safety assessments before novel, synthetic, man-made additives are put into the food supply, there should be mandatory food safety assessments. That's not currently being done. Like with genetically engineered foods, consultations are entirely voluntary. The market approvals are based entirely on industry research. FDA is not conducting safety assessments. No other government agency has done safety assessments. And government is protecting the studies as trade secrets, as private, as confidential business information. So the public can't even scrutinize these studies. And without labeling, we just really have no idea what additives are in our food. So I think safety assessments and labeling.
If I may jump in. When I was an undergraduate, I did an internship with FDA, and for 12 weeks I essentially paid to work for them. And we were testing imported products, particularly 1 week was all testing of imported produce for unauthorized pesticides. And what was shocking to me was that while we only tested 5%, at that time, 95% was rejected and would then go down the coast to the next port of call where 5% would be tested. And you do the math, and when I think of government wanting to have monopoly on regulation, I worry. If they can't do that job, maybe we should switch to education and awareness, and not just for adults, start it in the grade schools. We spend an awful lot of time trying to regulate where education, I feel education would give us more bang for our buck.
Okay, you reminded me of what my answer was going to be, which is something similar. I think if you're buying a processed product, you really have very little way of knowing what the raw ingredients that went into it were, and maybe sometimes they're raw ingredients that only were created in a laboratory. At the other very far end of the spectrum is cooking everything that you eat from scratch with raw ingredients that you can actually identify, and I think there are a host of sociological challenges for people who would like to do that because they're concerned about the integrity of their food. I think that one of the reasons raw ingredients are so expensive compared to processed foods is because of our system of agricultural subsidies. So we really need to start back at the beginning if we're going to make the choice that an individual person faces at the supermarket a fair choice that actually gives them the opportunity to have some control over what they eat. So I know that's not really answering the question, but I think maybe it is.
Thank you. Now we know talk about food labeling, and I think more of us are reading the labels now than we used to. Food packaging contains factual information such as the nutrition labels, the ingredients, possible allergens, that kind of thing. It also provides marketing information that may or may not be factual. For instance, terms like healthy, light, immunity support, natural. I mean, you think about that one. Do you want unnatural food? Humane, pasture-raised. What should be the criteria for these marketing terms, and who establishes the criteria, or who should establish the criteria? I don't know who.
I'll go first in that. My dad worked in a big accounting firm for a while, and he told me that their main job was to get the tax code every year and figure out all the ways that they were going to find new loopholes so they could stay one step ahead of the government and still making sure their clients didn't have to pay too much in tax. And I sort of think about a lot of the proliferation of these labeling terms that we see in the same way. There's an effort to sort of get your hands around what natural means, what cage-free means, and eventually it may make its way to a regulatory level where governments try to say you have to adhere to these standards if you want to use that term, but industry is always going to be one step ahead of the government in that realm, I believe, and they're just going to come up with something else that to use in place of the term that's now a regulated term. I think the certified organic label is a very interesting one to consider. It is a federally regulated term. I don't know, you probably know how often the NOP board meets to reconsider standards. I think it's every 5 years.
Twice a year.
Twice a year, wow, that's often. And you can really trust, I believe you can really trust the USDA organic label. That's what I buy when I go shopping at the store. But it's also the case that every year there's quite a struggle between activist groups and industry groups. The industry groups would like to see the standard lowered so that they can include more things that are sort of questionable. Maybe they are a processed item that is an enzyme or something. Or they say, oh, well, these hop varieties that we use in brewing our organic beer are just not commercially available. We can't get access to them. There's no farmer who's growing them, so you should allow us to still label our beer organic, even though we're buying these conventionally produced hops. And the NOP board, that's the National Organic Program, says, okay, here's a list of ingredients that we think are okay to use and still receive the USDA organic label. So there's a flip side to regulation of terminology as well, in that once the government determines what a label means, it's subject to the influence of big money. So again, I would refer you to my answer to the previous question. That's all I have to say about that.
I like the idea of having a small number of official terms and let industry distract itself with the light and the this and the that, but have certain terms that carry credible scientific weight, like certified organic. And again, I'd go back to education. How many kids, how many fifth graders know that that chicken running around in a farmyard is the same unidentifiable thing they're eating at McDonald's? I mean, they don't. There's no connection. And we talked about regionalizing. I think that would go a long way toward bringing people back in touch with where their food comes from. The mega farms, the concentration of foods, the mass processing of foods, we've seen what that brings. So for labeling, I would say, rather than try to round up all of the potential label words and have the industry one step ahead all the way, put together a few official, a few sanctioned titles that have to be earned and advertise the daylights out of them.
I like that. I like that a lot. None of these terms that are in this list here have statutory weight. The only label that we've talked about here that has any statutory weight of law, is the National Organic Standards. Natural doesn't, light doesn't. They don't have the weight of law and they don't have the weight of enforcement. So it is a constant battle in the food world about who's going to get to claim what natural is and what isn't. And we've got more than 100 lawsuits currently going on over use of the term natural. FDA has said it doesn't want to define it. It has declined to define it. So it's gone back to the courts and it's being fought out. Not one of the lawsuits involving natural has been settled in court. They've all been settled out of court in multi-million-dollar figures. Consumers are ticked off about being betrayed. They're more than unhappy. They feel like they have been deceived. They want straight, honest information that's reliable. The nutrition facts panel, of course, and the ingredient panel, the ingredient listing, industry fought ingredient listings for 10 years. They didn't want to list the ingredients in their food because they didn't need to know. Consumers didn't need to know, and it was going to cost way too much money. Grocery manufacturers fought it for 10 years. When it was finally passed in 1990, they said, oh, well, it really didn't cost us anything at all. Cost wasn't a factor. So arguments are raised all the time about, oh, we can't do it because of this, or we can't do it because of that. But in the end analysis, labeling does not cost companies money. They will plaster their packages with everything they want you to believe, but they don't want to tell you what they don't want you to know. So who should decide what the criteria are? For me, there's just no question at all. It's got to be consumers. Industry should not be deciding because the labels are for consumers. Industry isn't purchasing the products, it's consumers, individuals who are purchasing the products. And so we have this constant push-pull. Government is at least 10 years behind consumers on labeling. At least 10 years. When consumers start saying they like trans fats, it took FDA, by the time FDA announced it this year, it's going to be gone, they're going to be banned, they've already all removed it. Manufacturers have removed trans fats from food, so labeling it has become almost silly because there aren't any foods that really contain it anymore. So by the time labeling catches up, sometimes the issue has already been dealt with, but consumers really need to be the arbiter of what those are. And right now, our regulatory system does not really take that into account. Today, I just saw that FDA gave the green light for irradiating lettuce and spinach. Despite voluminous, overwhelming comments from consumers, they don't want irradiated spinach and lettuce. FDA ignored the consumer's point of view and gave the green light anyway. So, go figure. That's what we have.
Yes. Yes, amen. I find it interesting. One thing that I always like is the way they, remember all the cholesterol scare, your dietary cholesterol? Every cereal packet had no cholesterol. It's like plants don't have cholesterol. Unless you have put animal fat in there, there never was any cholesterol. But they implied that they've taken it out. And they do that all the time. Yeah. Yeah, and, well, I'm answering for you. But, you know, the food pyramid, remember that? They fought that for years. And the reason that you have dairy where it is, and you don't have soybeans in the protein thing, is because the meat and dairy fought to have a bigger slice. And they didn't care about whether that's what you should be eating, they just wanted a bigger slice. Okay, we're doing pretty good for time. Here's the biggie. If you were food safety and labeling czar, you could do anything you wanted. Ability to implement any action, even with this Congress. What 2 actions would you take and why?
Go for it.
What a,
And we're ahead because one of our speakers didn't show up, so I'm going to say that you guys can have 5 minutes for this one.
I don't have.
just the thought of being czar, what a wonderfully delicious, dangerous thought. I would go two-pronged with it. One of the things that's always annoyed me about the food labels, the nutritional labeling, is calories and serving size. Calories versus serving size. I know full well if I have some little pint of high-end ice cream that's got more calories in it than 3 people should consume in a day, I'm not going to stop. And yet when I see that and it says that there are XYZ number of servings in there, you're just playing a shell game with the numbers. But I wouldn't take away from the recommendations of the FDA where they put the calories and they're going to regulate what is a serving size. I'd still like to see something that says how many calories per package on there too. So there's many different tools for the consumer to use. And the other thing I would do with my massive power would be to put the full weight of the government and some imaginative people's minds behind educating the kids. Get them when they're young, when they're still learning, when they're still curious, they're not jaded and cynical. Get packages into the hands of the science teachers in the elementary schools. They're dying for material. I mean, they are already working for next to nothing. Elementary school teachers, to me, are heroes. And if we can put the tools in their hands to engage kids in becoming aware of where their food comes from, what all those numbers on the side of that cereal box mean, maybe we can pry them away from their electronic devices long enough to turn them into future voters so that industry won't run the show and the politicians won't run the show. Those are the 2 things I would do. Multiple labeling formats to give the consumer what works for them, and then educate the consumers before it's too late, before they've grown up.
Do you want to go, Siri?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Okay, if I were the czar, Ina, I would only do one thing, and that would be to eliminate all federal subsidies for crops for farmers. They don't need them.
Yay.
What they do is just entrench a system of monoculture that's not good for soil, it's not good for farmers, it's not good for consumers, it's not good for anybody. I make my living farming. My farm pays my mortgage, it pays my health care, it pays all my bills, and I don't have any insurance from the government. I self-insure by diversifying what I grow, by diversifying how I sell it, by being a creative business owner. I carry plenty of insurance for a variety of things, but nobody pays me when one of my crops doesn't perform as expected. So I think it's never gonna happen, but it sure would be nice if we could get all those Midwestern farmers to take responsibility for their own choices and grow some things that people should actually be eating.
I really like that one. I wish I had thought of that, and I didn't. I wish I did. But that would be really, if I were queen, that would be at the top of my list, too. But I also feel that the nation needs a new agency to deal with the new technologies that are coming into our food system, unlabeled, genetically engineered foods, nanotechnology, even synthetic biology, as now people haven't even heard about that, and that is an entirely new field which uses it creates a modified organism with artificially created genetics and not taking genetics from any living species. So none of those things it's already in foods, it's already in packaging, it's entering supplements. None of that is labeled. Nanotechnology is at a scale that permeates cell walls. There is concern even from FDA about the health impacts of nanotechnology, nanotech-sized particles in food. I think that we need a new agency to deal with these technologies, and I'm going to give you one example. The genetically engineered salmon has been recommended for approval by FDA as a new animal drug, not as a food, not as an additive, but as a new animal drug, because there is no framework to assess the health and safety of eating an engineered fish or animal. So it's being recommended as a drug. The company's own studies found problems with this fish. It found elevated levels of IGF-1 growth factor, which is linked to various human cancers and elevated levels. We don't know whether it's going to be approved. It was approved by Canada. But having a framework to deal with novel creations, just because they can be created does not necessarily mean that the creators have the background or the experience or the credentials to assess the safety of the creations that they're making. So I think an agency to deal with these new technologies would be really important. We don't have that right now. And I would also like to see a REACH protocol like Europe has. Here in this country, products and foods or additives are approved for the market without safety assessments, without being proven safe, and they're pulled off only when they're found to be dangerous and harmful. And even then it's like moving the Russian army to try to get any kind of action on something that has been found harmful. So having safety assessments beforehand, I think, would go a long way. In Europe, what they do is they require safety assessments to prove something is safe before it's released on the market. That would be a very sensible thing, I think, to me.
I don't know if sense comes into a lot of legislation. It's like the thing about the banks and the mortgages, that they wanted legislations to ask for proof of income. And you're thinking, weren't they doing that already? I mean, they were going to lend money without knowing. But yeah. Okay, do we have questions from the audience? As Mary said, we're running a little ahead of time. Is there more that you three would like to say? Or you? We've got cards there. It would be easier if you could get the cards up. Where are the cards? Allison? She said she had cards.
Tell us more about nanotechnology.
Can one of you answer that question on nanotechnology? I know it's little tiny things.
I can tell you a little bit about it. I don't know a terrible amount about it. We've only done one brief article on it, and we're looking at it again. What it is a technology that makes naturally occurring substances, and it refines them into way smaller particles, measured in microns. So it's like 1/1000th of a meter is basically what it is. And the particles are so small that FDA has said that companies cannot assume that they have the same properties as their natural whole-size counterparts. When you create an artificially synthetic size, it permeates cell walls and it seems to have the capacity to do damage. One that is very commonly used is in sunscreens. I think it's zinc oxide is sometimes is a nanotech form. We have stripped our stores of zinc oxide products for that reason. But nanotech particles are also being used in packaging, like in the packaging that food actually goes in, and there is migration. It's just not being regulated whatsoever. FDA said, yes, you cannot assume that these are safe like their whole-size counterparts, but we're not requiring labeling. They said, don't assume they're safe, but we're not going to label it. So we can't even know where it is, where they are.
Interesting. I've got one question. Have we got any more?
I can answer.
I think there was some question on the radiation. Was that
Can I-
radiation?
Can I just read her question here? And I might tackle it a little bit. What is the problem with irradiation? What is it, is the question. When I was in graduate school, my thesis advisor was our radiation specialist. And he explained food irradiation to me this way, that you put a food product into an area where there is a radioactive source, and the subatomic particles that are coming off that source are bombarding the food, whatever's being irradiated, and damaging the DNA of the foods that are being bombarded, and also damaging the DNA, hopefully fatally, of any pathogens that might be there. But there is a change in the chemical structure that is the intention is to make the structures, whether they're viruses or bacteria, to be biologically inactive, to render them, to kill them. But the concern, of course, is what's it doing to the rest of the biological material involved in the food? So irradiation is essentially, well, it's akin to giving it a big X-ray. That's in X-rays are a form of irradiation, particles bombarding a product.
A couple extra things. FDA has acknowledged that it does degrade nutrient value, especially of vitamins, but vitamin degradation is not that unusual. Vitamin degradation will occur even in boiling. You know, any kind of cooking will degrade vitamins. It wouldn't affect minerals, but just vitamins. But irradiation also does create something called unique radiolytic properties, which are not well understood. They're not well documented, but ERPs, the ERPs for short, do not occur in food in nature. They simply do not exist. So we don't really know what ERPs are, and they're not documented, not studied very well, but they have been found. And as I understand it, ERPs have been found to be carcinogenic. So.
Here's one that's probably for Siri, but feel free to jump in. What is the difference between an organically certified vegetable and a regular vegetable, for example, broccoli?
So if you want to sell your broccoli with a certified organic label on it, it means you have to adhere to a set of standards that are vetted by the National Organic Standards Board, and they really trace their roots to the original biological farming that was arrived at by a couple of pioneering folks in the, well, some of them go way back, but in the 1950s and the 1960s, Rodale was a big proponent of organic growing practices in the United States, and there was a very grassroots movement, a way to grow food without synthetic chemicals, synthetic inputs, poisonous things that kill stuff, but also synthetic fertilizers, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that are manufactured in factories and used as soil inputs to provide nutrients for crops. Over time, there became a movement because there was a lot of misrepresentation and mislabeling using the word organic, and it has slowly moved to federally regulated term. So now there's a set, and it really comes down to, in some ways, a kind of holistic approach to farming that cares for soil and water and animals on farms, but primarily is a list of approved inputs for organic farming and a list of inputs that are not allowed. So there's a lot of organic produce out there in the marketplace. I mean, most of it, really, that a fellow grower described to me as grown using input substitution. So the model of farming is no different than a conventional farm, really. Instead of using manufactured synthetic nitrogen, we use composted chicken manure that comes from a factory farm. It's input substitution rather than holistic management of a farm. So what it does guarantee you if you buy organic broccoli is there are no really nasty synthetic pesticides that were sprayed on that broccoli. There are pesticides, including broad spectrum pesticides that kill a lot of different types of bugs that are completely allowed and permitted under the national organic standards. And most big farms that are producing produce that looks really nice in the supermarket that says organic on it are likely using some sort of these, they're naturally derived substances. So there's one that comes from a chrysanthemum flower, and there's one that's a, what's Bacillus thuringiensis? It's a bacterium.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are all allowed. And for the most part, they tend to be much more benign for human health, but not always. Copper sulfate is something that's used to control fungus in grapes and other crops, and that's an organically approved input for farming. But a lot of people think maybe it's not the best for either the people who are working in the farms where they're spraying that, or for the people who are eating that produce. So it goes a long way. I would always recommend that you choose organic produce, organic dairy, any organic food over conventional food. But when we talk to people about our growing practices at the farmers market, I like to let people know that it doesn't cast this 100% perfect blessing over everything that people might like to think that organic label means. It doesn't speak to anything about holistic farm practices, and it doesn't speak to anything about labor practices. But it does say, for sure, this list of things that are pretty nasty were not used on your food.
That would include harmful synthetic pesticides, no antibiotics or growth hormones, no irradiation, no sewage sludge as a fertilizer, which is very common in other conventional farms, and no genetic engineering. So the things that you won't get are just as important, perhaps, as what you do get. There are studies, Washington State University recently came out with a study confirming, without a doubt, that organic milk has significantly improved nutritional profiles over non-organic milk. And it's a field called epigenetics. It's starting to become more popular. There have been numerous studies over the last 10 or 15 years showing increased nutritional properties in organic foods. It's not proof, but the evidence is increasing.
Here's one that I think is relevant here in Seattle. What do you think about eating farmed fish? I mean, I know we see bumper stickers, friends don't let friends eat farmed fish. Who wants to jump in on that one?
I've eaten both farmed and wild fish, and maybe it's me, I can't tell a difference, but I have friends who are in the academic side of fisheries science, and what their opinions are makes me feel that farmed fish, is a necessity because of our population's need for protein, but certainly farmed fish present a huge ecological danger, just as any sort of mass production, concentration, monoculture does anywhere. And so I'm of two minds about it. Copper River salmon, wonderful stuff, but a bit spendy. And then you've got the farm-raised fish that are winding up in the highly processed fast food chains, and you're seeing it everywhere because the public cannot distinguish unless there's an absolute labeling thing. Public generally can't distinguish even between different species of salmon, let alone what's farmed and what's not. So I'm of two minds. We have lots of hungry people, and we have an environment that's endangered.
I'm going to take a stab at that. We do have a lot of hungry people. Fish farming is, there are both contained on-land systems, which I don't really have much of a problem with. They're contained, the waste is contained. It doesn't destroy the environment in a marine. When you've got a floating net cage, the fish waste settles and it basically creates a dead zone underneath that fishing net pen. The biggest problem I have with farm fish is, like, farm salmon has 16 times the levels of PCBs that wild salmon has. So you're getting 16 times more PCB compounds in that fish. That's not something that I want to have. You're getting PCBs primarily because the pellet feed fed to the fish concentrates the PCBs. So there is a nutritional difference in that respect. Plus you're getting artificial food dyes. There's a fan showing the color, pick your color to dye your salmon. So there's artificial food dyes, there's more PCBs. The other problem I have with it, aside from being a concentrated feedlot, just like any concentrated feedlot for cattle, it's a concentrated floating feedlot at sea. It's a rape of the ocean. A whole strata of the marine food chain is pulled out to feed farmed fish. Anchovies and sardines, which are subsistence fish down along the South American coast, in Peru in particular, are being decimated, and the people of Peru and Chile are not able to feed themselves like they were able to because the anchovies and sardines are being pulled out to feed the farmed fish for us to consume. There are social inequity issues. There are completely chopping out that level in the marine food chain, causing collapse in some species. It's aggravating the collapse of other marine species. To me, the solution is use some inland farm fishing systems, but calculate the net protein loss. The loss of protein increases when you have farmed fish. It's a more efficient feed system translating in the wild environment to a wild-caught fish than catching and feeding and pelletizing. And not to mention the amount of petroleum energy that's used to create those pellets to feed the fish. So to me, it's not really a sustainable system.
And if I can jump in here, the energy flow, energy is a one-way flow. I mean, once we transfer it into something else, it's gone. Materials recycle, as Siri pointed out. We're recycling those all the time. But farmed fish, in lots of cases, farmed products, aquaculture, and those kinds of things, there's greater energy inputs than you get out. And that's a net zero sum. You know, we have to at least get some percentage out rather than being putting 4 times, you know, like calf feedlots you were talking about. I think there's a figure that we put 4 times the amount of energy in that we get out in the beef. And there's a limit to the amount of energy. Yeah, the sun will go cold long after we're gone, but yeah. To sort of continue that thing, address the relationship between organic and non-organic farming and the long-term implications for our planet's environment, water, soil, and workers.
I'll address all of that.
And it sort of flows on.
All right. Boy, that's a heck of a question.
It's a big question.
Really, really good, skilled, conscientious, organic farmers are doing their best to work within natural systems to produce food. But in its essence, almost all farming is a form of mining. We're growing plants in an intensity in a place that they don't exist in nature, and we're trying to control as much as we can to get those things to grow and look like what people actually want to buy and eat. So it's, as much as we try to work in concert with nature and roll with the punches and deal with the weather and be stoic and not cry too much, it's really what we're doing is a completely unnatural act. Farming is forcing something to grow where it would not grow. And I think that what we really need to do if farming is really going to be a tool for making positive change in the world, the more people that are aware of that, the better. Because we all have to eat. That food has to come from somewhere. And we're just making a series of trade-offs. You can't have everything be perfect in anything, as we all know. So we use inputs. We use water. We use sun, which is free. We do take something out of the soil when we harvest vegetables and bring them to market. And on our farm, we fallow 50% of our arable acreage every year. We leave it in long-term fallow and cover crops for nitrogen fixation. It's the long-term goal of our farm to minimize our all outside inputs that come onto our farm in the form of any compost, fertilizer, Energy, we use an awful lot of energy to drive tractors, to cool our produce, to keep it in a marketable condition for more than one day after harvest. So my long-term goal for my farm is to scrutinize all the different ways that we use outside resources and to hopefully find a balance where what we're giving back in the form of things that people need to be healthy and live productive lives are greater than what we're taking to produce that food.
I would say briefly that on the spectrum of organic to inorganic, it's the same spectrum of sustainability, long-term true sustainability, and it's opposite. Soil depletion's been seen in this country many, many, many times over. You drive through Northern California, especially where cotton's been grown, and the soil is white with salt and completely unusable. It's a sustainability issue. If you do farming right, if you do food production right, it's a forever thing. If you don't, you are in the same league with the folks who are forced to cut down rainforest to subsistence raise beef in South America.
I can't remember the question.
Oh.
How are we going to save the world?
Relationship in terms of the larger ecosystem, for our planet's environment and the larger ecosystem, the relationship between organic and non-organic farming and the long-term implications of that.
Yeah, I think the salinization and chemical use is a big thing. I think the pesticide use to me is very considerable, not just because we don't want to consume more pesticides, we'd like to minimize it as much as we can. I have to confess, I have used the worst of the worst of the worst herbicides and pesticides in the world, and I did not know the damage that they could cause until about 15 years ago. And that was really when I got involved in this line of work. It was just asking questions, and one thing led to another. It was the research that led me. One of the differences that I can say between organic and non-organic farm systems and the impact on the environment and the consumers, and I include the consumers in that, all of us. BT came up, for example. You'll often hear that Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, is used in both systems. In organic, it's used as a spray. In conventional system, it's used genetic engineering, basically. When organic farmers use it as a spray, it degrades very rapidly in the environment, subject to light and moisture. It degrades quickly. It doesn't stay in the environment. It doesn't accumulate in the soil. When BT is engineered into corn or another plant, it is expressed full strength all the time. It does not degrade. It does not degrade with light. It does not degrade with moisture. It stays in the plant full strength. So when you're eating that ear of corn, you're eating a pesticide. It's literally registered as a pesticidal plant. It is registered with EPA as a pesticide. We know that the herbicide load from genetically engineered crops is increased by 500 million pounds. The USDA's Economic Research Service just came out with a report very recently, just this week, and it affirmed that yields have not increased from genetic engineering. In many cases, yields are less than the conventional yields. This is the Economic Research Service of USDA. It confirmed that herbicide use has increased dramatically by at least 30% because of genetically engineered crops. So it's an increased pesticide load on the land, it's an increased pesticide load that goes into the water, into our drinking water, and we're literally eating it every time we're eating those foods. So better living through chemistry? I don't think so. When you're eating it, when you're literally eating a literal pesticide, I do have problems with that, and I do think they should be labeled and people should know, and there is an impact on the environment when you're burdening the land with 500 million pounds more of herbicides, not less. And that's one thing that's actually really wrong in this league report. For some reason, it was reflecting, oh, it'll increase yields and better nutrition. There isn't one seed or one plant with improved nutrition or yield from genetic engineering. So there are huge, huge differences.
Go ahead.
I do want to comment on that and clarify a little with the uses of BT. We're actually talking about two different things here. BT as a bacterium attacks certain pest species. You're literally waging germ warfare on the pests involved. The separate question is what the bacteria does to the pest is done through its genetics, and if we then take portions of the bacterial DNA and insert them into corn or another product, that's genetic engineering. And so one is more of a germ warfare and the other is genetic engineering. And I have no issue with the germ warfare aspect because, as she said, the bacterium is very specific to what it attacks and does not compete in nature and is very soon completely diluted. But taking genes from one species and put them into another is a totally a black box and shouldn't be done willy-nilly.
Something in Greek mythology about that, isn't there? Making the mixed, the chimera. Let's shift a little bit. Are there any foods that you think we should avoid due to safety concerns? I know some people publish the list of the dirty dozen, which is now the dirty 15 or the dirty 20.
Dirty everything.
Yeah.
Is the question about foods we should avoid?
Yeah, due to safety concerns.
I can say that the foodborne outbreaks every year in this area are dominated by outbreaks associated with people consuming raw oysters. I would be the last one to take away people's ability to make choices, and I think education is the answer in that case. I don't believe that government has a place in saying, thou shalt not eat, but it does have a huge role in saying, here's why it might not be such a good idea. If I may, I took a medical resident in the field with me. We do this fairly routinely. It's part of their rotation. And during the course of the day, we visited several sushi restaurants. And this medical resident informed me that she loved sushi, and she particularly loved the sushi made with salmon and some other cold water fish, and asked why we insist that it be frozen, rock solid. And I explained that that kills the parasites, the various worms and things, but there's no guarantee necessarily that that operator of a restaurant hasn't gone out and just to fill a gap, couldn't get it, brings in raw product that's never been frozen. And this, I could tell that there was a little disbelief. She sent me a video the week later that I still have, where she and a friend were out dining, and the video has the worm emerging from the fish, doing the dance of expiration on the plate. And the accompanying email told me that she was swearing off sushi for life.
I think there's two different safety concerns in most people's minds. There's, if I eat this my whole life, will it give me cancer? And then there's, if I eat this today, will I get sick tonight? So I think there's a whole bunch of things you shouldn't eat if you're worried about long-term health impacts. I think, like I said before, when you're talking about raw produce or any food that's a potential vector for a pathogen, it's kind of an odds game. And you can improve your odds by knowing more about this original source and the chain of custody of that food before it got to your plate. But it's still no guarantee. It just isn't. And I wouldn't buy that bagged salad, probably. Those pre-mixed bag salads you get in the supermarket. So one thing that is true is, so when they harvest those little cute baby mixed greens that we probably all eat on almost a daily basis these days, Those are coming from enormous farms, huge swaths of fields, and then they are mixed in water. So water becomes the vector for any pathogen that's on any leaf just because a bird flew over and pooped on it, and it can transfer it to a whole bunch of other leaves, and these are processed in enormous batches, and then they're sealed up in these airtight containers, and they're shipped long distances. And it's, I believe, a fact that, I shouldn't say I believe, it's a fact that pathogens in that environment will proliferate over time. So if you buy a bag of mixed greens at a farmer's market and it was harvested by the farmer within the last couple days, your odds of that making you sick are significantly lower than buying a similar product in a supermarket where it's had a couple weeks to gestate and proliferate. So again, there's no guarantee out there. Food exists in nature and it's handled by humans. So you can increase your odds of staying healthy by knowing where it came from.
And washing your hands.
Yeah. Washing the hands of the person in front of you in line. But they're transported and packaged the same way, and then they just dump the container into the bin. So don't be tricked.
I love so many food. I love all food. I really can't think of anything I don't like or don't eat, and I wouldn't tell anyone not to eat anything, but there are things that I have concerns about, and because I'm on this National Arsenic Task Force, I have been living and breathing arsenic for about 2 years.
Oh, don't breathe that.
And, because there is no federal standard at all for arsenic in food, and because this country has a legacy, we have a history of using arsenical pesticides on grape vineyards, on citrus crops, on cotton crops, where rice fields are now grown. We do have some crops that have elevated levels of arsenic. Rice has the unfortunate ability to uptake more than others, so Consumer Reports came out with a very good article a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, and it recommended portion sizes for children, and that is the one guideline that I would offer is I would consult that if I had children or if I had friends who had little children. I would follow the guidelines of restricting rice food intakes in young children. The recommendation was not to use rice formula for newborns, not to use rice cereal, do not give rice milk to children under 5. We know that apple juice and pear juice has high levels because arsenical pesticides were used on apple and pear orchards, and they accumulated over the years. Apple juice can be very high. The standard that was proposed for apple juice at 10 parts per billion is the same as it is for water, although we do know that the level for arsenic in drinking water set by EPA is about 3 times higher than what it should be for causing cancer, for cancer causative, at 3 parts per billion. We know that cancers occur at 3. The level is set at 10 because it's politically feasible. Water districts and people on well water cannot get their arsenic levels below 10. But it's a very toxic substance, and for children especially, because it has developmental impacts throughout life and it causes cancers on a 20-year delayed cycle. I would limit foods and I would diversify my diet very, very much. I would not eat the same foods all the time. I would eat different foods, and I would not give children rice foods, apple juice, pear juice, in excess of the recommendations from the Consumers Union. So that's the one that I am concerned about.
I think we might have time for one more question, and these two kind of go together. One talks about the cost of getting organic certification, and there is a cost involved, as Siri probably knows. I went to an organic CSA Raven and Spade on Whidbey, and she said she spent $4,000 on organic seed the year before. And I'm thinking, you have a private income.
She's lucky she got the seed. She could find it.
yeah, she said that was part of the problem because she had to go to so many places, and now places that did do organic seed don't anymore. And then the other one is just the cost of organic produce. So many people don't even consider buying organic foods because of the cost. Can you suggest a remedy?
So I'd love to answer that question. For one, my farm is not a certified organic farm. I have some pretty strong political objections to the way that the whole National Organic Program works, and we sell all of our produce direct to the end user. I have robust relationships with our farmers market customers, with our CSA members. We are completely transparent operation. We hold ourselves to a standard that I believe is significantly higher than the National Organic Program standards, and we guarantee that we are not using anything that would not be allowed under their National Organic Program, because were we ever to opt to sell our produce wholesale, there's a significant price premium that you can get if you're with the organic label if we were to sell into the wholesale market. So we reserve the option through our growing practices to basically, we could snap our fingers, fill out our certification paperwork, and be certified organic within a matter of a couple months. However, for 7 years, I don't believe I've ever lost a single sale at a farmer's market, to a restaurant, to any of our members of our CSA, because I said, we've opted out of the National Organic Program. However, the cost of producing what we do is exactly the same as it would be if we were an organic farm. I would say we have worked for 7 years to build a business that is financially sustainable and that enables us to pay our workers minimum wage. And my husband and I gave ourselves a raise this year. We were making below minimum wage, and now we're making $10 an hour. So I've attended a whole lot of policy meetings and committees and workshops and things about food justice and food access and sustainable agriculture, and I will frequently see written up on a whiteboard somewhere a whole list of ways that we need to fix the food system, and it'll say, we need to make farming economically sustainable for farmers, and we need to pay a living wage to farm workers, and we need to make healthy, fresh, organic food available to all income levels. I don't have the answer for how we're gonna do that. I don't think it's possible in the world we live in today, because the alternative, the food that comes in a box that you don't know what it is so cheap. And the reason it's cheap is because of a whole network of government programs and crop subsidies and cheap fuel and cheap labor. Frankly, this is the last thing I'm going to say. I'll let someone else talk. But in California, they have a agricultural minimum wage of about $7.50 an hour. In Washington State, our minimum wage right now is $9.30 an hour. When we're selling produce, whether it's at the farmer's market or into the restaurant sales that we do, we're competing against California farms. They grow all the same produce that we do. And even if all of our other costs of input were the same and we operate on the same scale as those big California farms, they've got that labor for us is 2/3 of our cost of doing business. It's huge. I mean, organic seed is expensive, and insurance and tractor fuel and stuff, that's expensive too, but it pales in comparison to how much we pay our workers. So I don't know. I think that's a question that needs to be addressed by we need to talk about that on a national level. And when we've got rising minimum wage here in our state, which is great for a lot of people, but California is strategically keeping the price of their agricultural labor low, and that $7.30 only applies to farmers who are actually paying their workers fairly. There's rampant, well-documented case of folks not getting paid what the law says they should be getting paid. So we're competing, that's what we compete with. And you can buy a $3 bunch of kale from me, or you can buy a $2.50 bunch of kale from California. But when you buy that $2.50 bunch of California kale, remember that the water to grow that kale came from the Colorado River, and it may not keep coming. So.
I will say that I keep beating the drum for public education. And if we know where our food comes from, if I know that, say, that I've driven through the town where that farm is, that says something. That adds a value that California cannot add. And that's going to be reached by public education. I don't know if the schools do it anymore, but when I was a kid, we got to go and see the farms. We got to go, they were field trips. I don't think they do that anymore. To the fields, yes. And it was not to the big co-ops, the big agricultural entities that dominate now. So I will go back to education. We've got to raise a crop of future adults that do better job than we have.
I'm going to try to take a little bit of a different tack. I think we need to think about food differently. We need to think about what we're paying for and see things differently. Americans are paying less for food than any other country in the world. If we cut the price of food here by 20%, it still would be not cheap enough for most people. If you cut it in half, it still wouldn't be cheap enough. Food is never going to be cheap enough to satisfy the American desire for cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And I kind of don't understand that, because we want quality clothes, we want a fancy car, we want a nice looking home and a good address, we want good, better, and best, but cheap food. And I think those are really upside down values. I think we need to value our food more than we value our cars. And we all know that a Mercedes-Benz costs a lot more than a Ford Escort. They're not the same vehicles. They're not the same product. And this food is not necessarily the same as this food. All food is not created equal. And I do think we need to get ourselves accustomed to the idea of paying for what we really want to have. We don't pay a lot for food. We're paying a lot for other things. And I know people who shop in our stores, and our stores are not cheap. Our stores are not cheap. Organic food is not cheap. There are not subsidies. But I know people who are taking the bus and not having a car anymore. I know people who are on WIC, who are on women, infants, and children. I know people who are on very limited incomes, and they are choosing to invest their money on good nutrition and themselves. They are not choosing to spend it on cars and other things. So I think it's an American value system where we worry about the cost of food. I don't think it's the cost of food. I think the problem is our perception of what we're getting and our value system. And I would rather see people value food and how it's produced and quality more than other things in our lives. So the cost of food, also the price for food, the price that we pay at the register is a lie. The prices lie to us when we check out at the register in many cases, especially for organic food. It doesn't take into account the land erosion or the degradation of soil, the salinization. It does not take into account the rape of the ocean to feed those farmed fish. It does not take into account the increase in pesticides and herbicides on the land and the medical bills that we end up spending 10, 15, 20 years down the road because of that extra chemical load that we can't even trace. It doesn't account for, what else? I don't know, land, soil.
Abuse of farm workers from other countries.
Abuse of farm workers from other countries, or the loss of seed diversity. It doesn't calculate any of those costs into it. So to me, when you're buying organic food, it's a really good deal. It's a cheap deal compared to the cost of what you're paying for. When you're paying for other stuff, it's not a question of, well, let me think of that differently. When you're checking out at the register, those prices are lying to us, but also the true cost of food is a question of who's going to pay and when. Who's going to pay for the cost of that land erosion, the soil degradation, and the loss of seed diversity and the pesticide load. It's an issue of who pays and when, not whether we're going to pay, because we're going to pay. Are we going to pay in taxes later? Are we going to pay in cleanup, or are we going to pay at the register? I'd rather pay at the register, know what I'm getting, and reduce the costs elsewhere. That's how I see it.
Thank you. I think we're out of time for questions, but I have a few awards. This is not the Oscars. You You can eat most plants and you can eat flowers. Don't stuff everything in your mouth because some of them are toxic. But a lot of flowers are, and they do make a very tasty addition. And we can't afford to pay our panel, but. I love it. I love it.
Thank you.
You can eat pansies.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't do that.
Highly doubtful.
Let's see where they came.
Actually, I believe they are. I think, well, at least according to Fred Meyer, they were organically grown.
You know, one thing I keep thinking too is that our eating habits and our food habits change. My eating habits aren't at all like they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a constant evolution, and it's like baby steps all the time, or we're just always evolving and changing, and I think that's okay.
Oregon.
And I also have the two Marys. And
It says Hearts Nursery.
get one too.
You can visit them online.
Out of,
Oh, I gave you two. I don't know if you're supposed to get two.
Thank you very much for coming. I think that's it.
did you not get two?
That's okay.